Christianity has a tremendous need for a psychology like Jung's, and the widespread interest on the part of Christians in his psychology can be taken as a recognition of that fact. But the Jungian-Christian dialogue has been going on for more than 40 years, and something keeps it from flourishing. In this series of profiles, we're going to meet people involved in different facets of this dialogue and try to discover what is happening in it today and what hopes there are for it in the future. Today we're in San Diego to visit Jack Sanford. How did you get involved in the Jungian-Christian dialogue?
Well, I was born into the Christian faith. My father was a minister, and so was my grandfather and great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather on both sides of the family were all ministers, so that was very much in my blood. And as a young man, I decided to follow in the footsteps of my ancestors, and so I become an Episcopal minister. I still am officially an Episcopal minister. And I had parishes here in Southern California for 20 years. And then very early on in my theological work and in my early years there, I became acquainted with depth psychology. And my first mentor was an analyst, was Fritz Kunkel. And not everybody knows who Fritz Kunkel is right now. In these days, he died about the 1950s. But Fritz was, he was mentored as an analyst by Freudians and Jungians, but he worked out his own psychological methodology and was quite well known for a while until his rather precipitous death in the 1950s. But he remained very much of a Christian in his beliefs and attitudes, and so that combination was just what I needed at the time. But Fritz died very suddenly and unexpectedly, and then I was bereft of my spiritual guide and analyst. There should be a law against analysts dying in the middle of therapy, but that's what happened. So then by this time I made an acquaintance with Morton Kelsey, who we discovered we had a like interest in matters of psychology and religion. And it was Morton who suggested that I continue my analytical work first with Max Zeller, a Jungian analyst in Los Angeles, and then when Max, unfortunately, he moved away and wasn't going to come back for a while. Then I continued with another Jungian analyst by the name of James Kirsch. Worked many, many years in Jungian work with James, and also went for a while to Zurich and studied there at the Jung Institute. I never took a full course, but I took courses there. And so I had all that kind of a background. And meanwhile, I had also, in my theological training, taken special work in pastoral counseling and became a member of the, very early on in the inception of its organization, an organization known as the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, which was involved with the place where religion and psychology met, although it was not specifically Jungian. So that was the extensive background that I had, and I eventually went on and took the extra training was necessary and became a certified Jungian analyst quite some while ago. So that's kind of how it started.
How does Christianity relate to Jungian psychology?
First of all, there are Christians and there are Christians, and not all Christians are alike. And the kind of Christianity that I espouse, I'll tell it best by an anecdote. My father, as I mentioned, was a minister, and the rectory where we lived was right contiguous with the church, and he had a library, which was not remarkable. but he had a library. This would have been way back now. See, I grew up in the 1930s when I was just a boy, and I was born in 29. And the reason I tell this story is that his library had the writings of all the philosophers. It had the early writings about Einstein's theory of relativity and those discoveries that were just beginning to be made. It had works about all kinds of things on history. It had works on the Greek language, and it was a very rich kind of a library. My father was an intelligent man, but he was not a brilliant man, but he was an intelligent man. Anyway, to make the long story short, I was attracted to his library, and the reason I'm telling the story is that I could read any book in his library. I always had to bring them back, but I could read any book at all. I could read the atheistic philosophers, because that was part of the world of thought. So it was a very open and free intellectual and spiritual atmosphere, and that's what I thought Christianity was all about. I still think that's really what it's all about. So for me, my experience with Christianity was that it was a religion in which the mind is free to explore, and that which is true will attract the mind, and you don't need to be afraid of being led astray, because the truth will bring you back. Now, that was the Episcopal Church, and I still have a great affection for it, because I still think it's a church that has that kind of an attitude. But now, of course, there are all kinds of self-styled Christians, and so if, for instance, we spoke to what we call in our culture a fundamentalist Christian, that would not be the attitude at all. As a matter of fact, I don't think that I would be very popular with those people. So it's a different kind of an attitude. There isn't something called Christianity as though it was one homogeneous kind of a block and attitude and so forth and so on. That doesn't exist. There are different ways people have of exercising their Christianity. So I'm talking now about the kind of Christianity where the mind is free to explore as it will, and confident in the ability of the truth to bring the mind back to its proper center. So I think that's a very important distinction, because nowadays the more fundamentalist aspect of Christianity, while it certainly has some fine things to commend it, it's sort of taken the stage, and so many people identify Christianity with Christian fundamentalism. And now the Christian fundamentalists do not care for Jung. I think the fundamental point of view of Christian fundamentalism is the psychology and probing of oneself is not only not necessary, but I think they would have a negative view of it. Because if you start probing into the unconscious, you meet all kinds of things, you know. You meet all kinds of shadowy realities, and this and that and the other, and God only knows what you'll meet. Now, and so I think their attitude is, rather than explore those things, is to shut the door on those realities. Now, as soon as you begin shutting the door on certain things, then you have to narrow your scope down. And I think that's what fundamentalism does. I think it's what fundamentalism does in any religion. There are fundamentalists and other religious persuasions as well as in Christianity. So anybody, on the other hand, who gets into the workings of the unconscious and begins to look at their dreams and begins to, you're going now in a different kind of a world. You can't control what's going to come up in your dream, you know. And you have to look at what that says. And so it's an entirely different kind of a spirit that's at work. Now, with the kind of Christianity I espouse, there is no conflict because of the reasons that I gave you. But with others, there would be. And they would identify somebody who probes the world of dreams. They might have very dark things to say about such a person. Although because the Bible itself had a different point of view, you know. The Bible was filled with dreams. And there's a quotation from the book of Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and sent for Daniel to interpret the dream. And the king said, "Why did I have this dream?" And the answer that Joseph gave was, "The dream has come to you, O king." It was Daniel, not Joseph. "The dream has come to you, O king, in order that you may know the thoughts of your inmost mind." Now that's exactly, in that one sentence, is the theory of contemporary Jungian-type depth psychology with regard to dreams. But that aspect, that very open and exploring aspect of that we find in many places in the Bible is not always well represented in what you might call the general way of looking at things.
Now, on occasion, for example, you criticize Jung's ideas on evil.
Oh yes, I don't agree with Jung on those things.
And in that article you wrote, I forget the title now, in The Well-Tended Tree, that
Yes.
you sort of seem to probe some of his philosophical stances a little bit. Could you say a little bit about those two topics of how an open and critically thinking Christian still might have hesitations about this or that aspect of Jung's psychology?
Yes, well, I don't... I turn the same probing mind to my Jungian mentors and to Jung himself as I do anywhere else. And I'm not a slave to what Jung felt and believed, and Jungians aren't expected to be a slave to what Jung felt and believed. And Jung did have a sort of a way of dealing with the nature of evil, and he made ambiguous statements about the confusing statements, and spoke of God and God had being good and evil, and the darkness in God and things like that. And he really never clarified those things very well. And he was deaf against one of the Christian viewpoints about evil known as the privatio boni, which is a thing that says that evil has no reality in itself. It's the deprivation of the good. And he felt that was a very dangerous standpoint to have, because it minimized the reality of evil. And so, in that sense, he disagreed with a good deal of the Christian point of view about it. But I defended the doctrine of the privatio boni, but rather enlarged the scope of understanding of it. And and I've gone into this in some of my writings. So there, you see, I don't agree with Jung. I don't see evil as an integral part of God. I see it as something allowed for the higher purposes of God. And in that respect, I differ from Jung. Now, you understand, there is no Jungian doctrine about this. The Jungians do not have doctrines. Some Jungians might agree with Jung about this, and some of them might not.
What do you think led Jung to that kind of position? Maybe I can enlarge the question a little. At times he seems to be saying, not only does Jungian psychology or analytical psychology not know the things in themselves, you have to deal with the images, there is no way, he seems to almost be saying there's no way to know anything except in the way that his psychology proceeds. In other words, he seems to cut the ground out from under Christianity that way.
All right, I think, let's see if I hear what you're asking, Jim. Jung says that there is no way to know about good and evil except through psychology?
Let's use the example of God. You would say, I believe that
I
you
see.
know the God images,
Yeah,
but Christianity purports to know something.
Yes, that's true. Okay, I think you're getting at epistemology now.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, Jung's epistemology of the knowledge of God would be that the knowledge of God is mediated to consciousness through the self. The self as the archetype of God. And that's the way that one knows the nature of God. And he would tend to nullify theological speculation. And his argument would be that the self contained both good and evil. Now, first place, I don't agree with his premise that the only way to the knowledge of God is through the archetype of the self, the archetype of order and completeness within the psyche. He had sort of an encapsulated kind of epistemology, and I don't agree with that. Nor do I agree with his premise that the self is a compendium of good and of evil. He confused the words light and dark with good and evil. And yes, in the image of totality that the self represents, there's light and there's dark. But dark is not, you see, intrinsically evil. It's indeed the complement of light. One wouldn't know there was light if there wasn't also dark. But it's not tantamount to evil. Now this is where Kunkel comes in. Because Kunkel said, evil does not come, genuine evil does not come from the self. It comes from the ego. And to the extent that the ego is in an egocentric state, it partakes of the nature of evil. And that's so I remain a Kunkelian because he has that emphasis on the importance of the ego itself. In Jungian psychology, the ego is, we sometimes get the feeling that the main function of the ego is to observe the self, and that it's not an active agent of its own. So I would see that to the extent that human beings are egocentric, the ego partakes of the nature of evil. And that's not a Jungian position, that's Kunkel's position.
Okay, good, I like that.
And I've written about that, and some people occasionally read what I write, and some of them like it. But by and large, it's not a position that is very widely read in Jungian circles.
Let me approach that same question, same kind of central issue from another point of view. Sometimes you read literature where the process of individuation seems to be like a stand-in for the Christian interior life. In other words, they become identified, so that individuation leading to, process leading to individuation is identical, is treated almost as just different terms for the traditional Christian process of union with God. Now, how do you feel about that kind of amalgamation?
Well, let's see if I understand your question. I think you're saying that there's a position that says that the process of individuation is tantamount to the spiritual life, something like that? Right. Yeah. Okay. I think it comes close. Now, we have to have a broad definition of individuation. The narrower definition of individuation is that individuation comes as one becomes increasingly psychologically conscious, and then one individuates. And there's certainly a lot of truth to that. But that's by no means the only way people individuate. They can individuate very well without any formal psychological approach. It's, in the long run, it's how one lives one's life and how you meet what comes up in life that leads to individuation. And it can't be encapsulated in the Jungian idea of a purely psychological individuation. And I think that the real individuation takes place not only as people become more psychologically aware of who they are, but it takes place as one meets life. and especially as one meets the dark side of life, the difficulties of life. So one of my particular spiritual heroes was James Stockdale. Do you remember James Stockdale? James Stockdale was an aviator who was shot down in the, let's see, there's so damn many wars nowadays. You can eliminate the damn if you like. It was during the Vietnamese war, in Vietnam. And anyway, Stockdale was incarcerated in solitary confinement for many years. And finally, when that conflict was over, he was released. And he has written up his episode there. I conjectured to myself that I would have survived possibly for a week, never for more than 2 weeks. Of course, you don't know. Maybe if I'd been in that, I would have done better than I think. But he survived for something like 8 or 10 years and emerged a healthy man. And he tells how he did it. And the bottom line is how he and others who survived is, he says, we lived for others. And that's how we survived. We lived for our comrades. And that's how we did it. Now, that's individuation too, you see. And it's individuation through having been in the fire. And anything that was weak got burned away. And the self emerged in the we-ness of those men who shared the same experience. And that gets back to Kunkel. Kunkel said there was a we. The we, he said, comes when the egocentricity of the individual is no longer there. Then one can have a true we relationship with one's comrades in life. And see, that's something Jungian psychology lacks. Kunkel's psychology included it. Experiences like the one I dwelt upon here bring that about. So I have a broader feeling for individuation than I think that Jung had. I feel his point of view was too narrowly psychological, and important though that is, and that these other factors had to be contributed. Now, I'm not putting down the psychological. The importance of getting insight and understanding and identifying our complexes and understanding our ego psychology is tremendously important, and people who don't have some of that aren't going to get very far in the spiritual life, and they aren't going to get very far in their relationships with others. But see, I think I'm trying to get across here, I have a much more composite, larger view of how this process of individuation takes place, and at some point the more narrowly psychological meets up with something that can only be called the spiritual. And that has to take us further.
When you look at the future of the Jungian-Christian dialogue, where do you think we stand? Do you have hope for it?
There's a lot of it that goes on, you see, once again, when I was training to become an Episcopal minister, one of our programs was called clinical pastoral education. And what they did, they took us young chaps out and they threw us in the hospitals, you know, to sort of talk with the patients and minister to the patients, including the mental hospitals. And it was great, a lot of really good, solid training took place there. And we met up with a great many things. And in the course of that, we learned a lot of psychology. And but the psychology we learned was in no conflict with our Christianity. It just gave us a deeper insight into people and how to minister to them in one thing and another. So in various denominations that are open to that, there's always been that particular connection with psychology. Now with the Jungian psychology, the psychology goes more deeply. But it meets with some resistance because Jung deals with specifically religious and sometimes Christian issues. And in the ways I've described, there's often disagreement about that.
And what about from the Jungian side? Do you think there's any real interest in a dialogue with Christianity, or are they too busy with their own affairs to really spend much energy in that direction?
Well, I don't know how one can generalize about, I suppose, I would think that among lots of Jungians there would be a lot of interest in I think they would be very interested in more of a dialogue with, shall we say, the organized Christian position. I don't know how open they are to it. I think there are certain prejudices and biases that they carry into it. There's not enough discrimination from Jungians about that there are many different ways of being Christians, you see. I'm a Christian, but I don't think like fundamentalists think, you see. I'm just light years away from that for the reasons that I've explained. It's a totally different attitude, totally different psychology. And I don't think many Jungians are sufficiently aware of the diversity of attitudes that people call Christian.
When you look at the contemplation of John of the Cross and Jung's process of individuation, is it the same process in different terms, or are there some fundamental distinctions you would make?
No, I think there are some distinctions. And I think a process like the one you talked about of John of the Cross merges from the psychological into the spiritual. It's a spirituality more than a psychology. Now, right away, somebody's going to say, well, what do you mean by the spiritual? What's a spirituality? And I know what I mean by it, but it's very difficult to define what it is. But it's not the same thing as psychology and analysis and things of that sort. It's a spirituality, for instance, would have prayer to it. That would be an aspect of spirituality. Prayer is not a psychological process, it's a spiritual process. Your whole attitude, one could say, would have, might partake of spirituality, your attitude towards nature and towards life. And we don't hear much talk about the element of spirituality in Jungian thought. I think it's not hostile to it in any way, but it's a different kind of, they're first cousins, you know, but they're distinct. Christian religions and other religious traditions too have often developed a spirituality which is not to be equated with a psychology as such. And you don't hear much in psychological traditions, not even in the Jungian tradition, you don't hear very much about the development of a spirituality. And I think that's sort of and I think without the development of a spirituality, that the Jungian psychology as such is incomplete, and vice versa.
I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just throw the floor open to you.
Mm-hmm.
If you had, talking to people who have a sort of budding interest in this dialogue, what's your advice to them?
Well, I suppose if they were really interested in this dialogue, my advice would be to get some analysis if they haven't had it already. Because you can't really go very far in this dialogue without having gone through your own analytical process. Be like talking about swimming without having learned how to swim or something. It's not a very good image, but something like that. So I would have that. Let's see. What other advice would I have for people who are interested in that dialogue? I would certainly encourage the development of an attitude which is capable of and willing to just look at something to see what it is. Not many people are willing to just look at something to see what it is. They already have a resistance or a preconceived idea or whatever. And then one is blind to what is really there because of these preconceived ideas and things. So it takes that kind of a cultivation to be able to stand back and say, now what is this thing really, you know? What is it really? And be objective about it and open to it. And that also takes, I think, a certain amount of trust and a certain amount of ego strength.
Good. I like that.
Mhm.
I like that way you're distinguishing between Jung psychology and spirituality. I think that's a critical
Mhm.
thing, because if you get that distinction clear, I mean, it's hard to get clear, but somehow it's fundamental if there's going to be a dialogue.
Mhm.
Otherwise, the one's engulfing the other.
Mhm.
Jungian psychology is
That's
engulfing
right.
Christianity. Or,
That's right. And that's no good then, you know.
And there's
That's-
nothing to dialogue about.
There's nothing to dialogue about, right.
Yeah.